Hello, and welcome to the first section, Introduction to Linux. In this section, we will cover what Linux is, why you should use it, and what Linux is used for. In this first video of Section 1, we will go over a brief history of Linux and what it is. Maybe you have heard of Linux. Maybe you have even used it. But what is Linux? Well, Linux is a free and open source kernel that operating systems are built from. It was created by Linus Torvalds and was announced to the world in 1991 from a Unix newsgroup post. If you do not know what a newsgroup post is, well, it was an electronic town square before there was social media. As the story goes, Linus wanted an alternative to MiniX, which was a popular based Unix operating system at the time. MiniX cost money and was marketed towards students. Linus, a student at the time, wanted an OS that he could make changes to so he could support the computer hardware he owned. So, out of that necessity, the Linux kernel was created. Fast forward to today, and Linux is everywhere. Some claim that post Linus made in 1991 was one of the most pivotal changes in operating system history. You'll often hear Linux being used to describe a kernel or operating system. This can cause a lot of confusion. Linux is the name of the kernel, while Linux the OS is made up of other software alongside the kernel. This marriage between the kernel and software is usually referred to as a distribution. But for our purposes here, when I say Linux, I am referring to the OS as a whole, not the kernel. I will call out when I am specifically talking about the kernel. The Linux kernel is a large open source project. Open source is software that you can inspect, modify, or enhance. This means if you want to contribute to the Linux kernel or any other open source project, you can. You can fix a security hole, or even add a new feature. This provides a huge benefit over proprietary or non-open source kernels, as there are numerous developers who can and do contribute to the software every day. Open source software is governed by licenses. These licenses state what you can and can't do with the software. The Linux kernel ships with a license called the GNU General Public License v2, which means you have the right to use, distribute, or modify the software in any way. The other open source licenses that are available are beyond the scope of this course. Alright, we've talked briefly about the history of Linux, but what do you actually get with Linux? As I said earlier, Linux the kernel is not enough for an OS. You need other software to make it work. You can break down a Linux OS into three main parts. They are a kernel, system user space, and applications. A kernel is the base foundation of the OS. Without it, the OS would not do anything interesting. The Linux kernel manages resources and communicates with hardware like a CPU or a video card. It is also responsible for handling processes, memory, and file management as well. The system user space is an administrative layer for system-level tasks like configuration and installing software. This includes stuff like shells, daemons, which are just processes that run in the background, and a window managing environment usually referred to as a desktop. The application component is software that lets you perform tasks. These include everything from text editors like Vim and programming languages like Python. Almost all Linux distributions offer a central package repository where you could search for and download software. So there's a separation between the kernel and applications. This is called kernel space and user space respectively. The kernel enforces protected memory and access for stability and security. For example, when you start up a program like Firefox, you're running that application in user space. If the application needs access to some kernel functionality, it does so by calling an API to the kernel. As a Linux user, you will live in the system user space and application component most of the time. Let's do a recap of what we discussed so far. You learned about the brief history of the Linux kernel. You were introduced to open source software and how that makes Linux very unique. We also talked about the three main components of a Linux OS: the kernel, system user space, and applications. In this next video, I will discuss the benefits of Linux and why you should use it. See you soon.